I'm delighted to welcome the two speakers. The TMS is delighted to welcome the two speakers, Paul Pynkoski from Canada and William Horan from the United States. William has been an active and long-standing campaigner with Pax Christi in the United States. He is well respected for his long service and admired for his commitment to peacemaking and allied concerns. He has made extensive links with groups and individuals in the cause of peace, and he is alert to the need for integrity and hope in this cause. Alongside the work and life of Thomas Merton, William has also embraced, campaigned, and spoken in the cause of other peacemakers and champions of social justice, not least Martin Luther King and Mohandas K. Gandhi. William's title tonight is Thomas Merton on Nonviolence. Paul Pynkoski. Paul is the current secretary of the ITMS. He lives in Toronto and volunteers at his church, the Church of the Redeemer, where he helps in the drop-in centre for the homeless and the marginalised. He's a founding member of what has become a key organisation called Voices for Peace, an ecumenical conference on peacemaking. He has contributed to the Merton Seasonal, the Merton Annual, and Orthodoxy in Dialogue. His commitment to the sharing of the life, work, and legacy of Merton is well established, as is his belief that spirituality and Christian faith are deeply entwined and embodied in the routines and sufferings of the daily lives of ordinary people. His title, Discerning Christ Among Us, Proximity as Spiritual Praxis. Emily will do a moment of housekeeping, then we'll have a short pause, and then we look forward to welcoming and hearing William as the first speaker. Thank you, William.
My talk on Thomas Merton and nonviolence, in light of the conflict in the Ukraine, I haven't planned to deal with that directly. I'm going to try to limit my opening remarks to 5 or 10 minutes and then allow, hopefully, questions and comments about that Ukraine. But what I wanted to focus on to this, who are working with nonviolence, and mainly I wanted to focus on the comments made by two of his friends, Jim Forrest and Tom Cornell, in the hopes of trying to explain the problems that Merton had with these activists in nonviolence in the tactics that they were using in order to promote active participation by people generally in the nonviolent movement. So let me start with some quotes from Thomas Merton that indicates he had some reservations about the general way nonviolence was moving. Now, of course, Thomas Merton was a great fan of Gandhi and Martin Luther King, and he favored generally nonviolent approach to dealing with problems. But he had some reservations about the tactics being used by the activists. So a few weeks before he died, he died in 1968, he spent time in Alaska. And these quotes are from him initially are taken from his journal that he kept while in Alaska, which was published incidentally about 20 years after he died by the Merton Legacy Trust. But the title of the book that I'm taking these quotes from, Thomas Merton in Alaska, Conferences, Journals, and Letters. That's what I'm dealing with. He says at one point, most activists do not go in for naked violence yet, but they will. That's Thomas Merton on page 108. Now, on page 109, he says, nonviolence has become all fouled up and is turning into a sort of semi-violence. That's page 109. Now, in dealing with this kind of provocative statements, obviously Thomas Merton favored nonviolence, but he didn't like the general way it was going. So I want to use quotes now from Tom Cornell and from Jim Forrest in order to give us some feel for this restlessness that Merton had about the way that nonviolence was moving. Here's one from Jim Forrest first. He spoke at the Catholic Peace Fellowship Conference in South Bend, Indiana on 24 March 2007. And he writes, both Dorothy and Merton, now he's referring to Dorothy Day and Thomas Merton, both Dorothy and Merton were firm believers in patient efforts to simply communicate to others what the gospel is all about, what the church teaches, and the value of paying attention to saints who in various ways set a timely example. This is not so much carrying out what are sometimes called prophetic actions as engaging in ordinary acts of communication. While being patient and even supportive of me and others who engaged in such dramatic acts of civil disobedience as breaking into draft offices and burning draft files, neither Dorothy nor Merton recommended such tactics as a method of protest. So that statement there, neither Dorothy nor Merton recommended such tactics as a method of protest. Now, let me just leave it there with Jim Forrest and turn now to Tom Cornell. In recent years, Tom Cornell has stirred up the peace, the nonviolent movement, the peace movement generally, by his articles that he's writing, one of which is The Future of Christian Nonviolence. This was published in the Plow Quarterly, summer of 2015. And here, Tom Cornell, he writes, Thomas Merton pointed to the superficiality of much of what he saw coming out of the peace movements of the 1960s. The years since have been worse. We Christians need to recover what our ancestors in the faith knew about peacemaking. Okay, so that's the idea I want to get across, that these friends of Thomas Merton and others, of course, trying to explain the restlessness that Merton had in the presentation of nonviolence to the general public. I might just leave it at that point and see what people have to say about that restlessness as in general. So let's try it at this point. Can we open it up and see what people have to say about that? Do I hear any comments at all? May I? I don't, oh, I see one hand. Okay, so we'll let that Paul wants to say something.
Yes, William, what you said brought to mind Merton's discussion, and I can't remember exactly where it is, but his discussion on how sometimes nonviolent activists will provoke a response almost in a passive aggressive way, so that they're talking peace, but they haven't dealt with the conflict in their own hearts.
Yes, that's basically the idea of it. That's Merton had great reservations about how people should be at peace with themselves in order to deal with the overall conflicts. May I quote a little something? I don't see any more hands. I could quote something further from Tom Cornell along that line. This is from his article on the future of Christian nonviolence. This is Tom Cornell. In order to practice Christian nonviolence, we have to prepare ourselves through study. Nonviolence doesn't come naturally for most of us. Thomas Merton, the well-known author and Trappist monk, pointed to the superficiality of much of what he saw coming out of the peace movement of the 1960s. Lack of charity in the use of terms, shoddy thinking, and gratuitous assertions. If anything, the years since his death have seen worse. We Christians need to recover what our ancestors in the faith knew about peacemaking. That idea of more the approach of the historic peace churches, for example, in a more gentle approach towards nonviolence. Incidentally, Thomas Merton wrote quite a bit on Gandhi, on nonviolence, and one of the articles that he wrote on Gandhi had a title, Gandhi, the Gentle Revolutionary. The kinds of tactics that Gandhi used, of course, Gandhi didn't like secrecy. He wanted everything out in the open and very polite in dealing with his adversaries, the British, and felt that even at the end of his life, he had quite a statement on his abhorrence of secrecy. Let me read. I don't see any more hands. I'll read.
William, I think Patty Jones has
Okay, fine.
an intervention to make.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Patty.
Thank you. Did Mr. Horan, did I hear you say that you might suggest how Thomas Merton might approach dealing with the war in Ukraine?
Well, yes, I think that people might be interested in that. I could speculate on it a little if you want.
Yes, well, don't let me interrupt you, but I'd be very interested in hearing how you think Thomas Merton would approach that war.
Okay, I'll try to respond to that briefly. The general principle of nonviolence would imply that it takes two to make the conflict, two sides. We got here the Russians and we got the Ukrainians. Now the Russians, one side would seem to have to use nonviolent methods in order to avoid the war. And wars, in Merton's view, are getting to the point where they're no longer a viable means of settling the conflict. So if the Russians, of course, should not be using the violent means of bombing and all, but they're not too likely to give that up right away. So the Ukrainians, they should not be using violent means in order to repel the Russians. So that what it would mean is that one side has to give up, at least one side has to give up the violent means. In this case, it seems to me what the Ukrainians should do is give up their violent resistance to the Russians. They would have to resort to nonviolent means like what Gandhi and King used and suffer the consequences if necessary. But by giving up the violent means of resistance to the aggression, they would be on the more moral, higher ground and trust in the Lord and use as best they can nonviolent means in order to deal with the injustice. Are there any more people interested in commenting on that? I was going to read from a brief statement from Gandhi on how the methods he used about secrecy. In general, the peace activists have relied heavily on plotting a secret kind of confrontation with the authorities as the peace movement develops, very similar to what the Plowshares' actions do. They would plot, they would be a secret get-together first, and then try to plot a non-violent action in the hopes of kind of surprising the authorities and focusing on what, in general, non-violent principles, but still using secrecy. Here's what Gandhi said about secret organizations. Quoting Gandhi, "No secret organization, however big, could do any good. Secrecy aims at building a wall of protection around you. Ahisma disdains all such protection. It functions in the open in the face of odds and heaviest conceivable. We have organized for action a vast people that have been crushed under the heel of unspeakable tyranny for centuries. They cannot be organized by other than open, truthful means. I have grown up from youth to 76 years in abhorrence of secrecy. There must be no watering down of the ideal." That was Mahatma Gandhi, quoted by Thomas Merton in his book, Gandhi on Nonviolence, page 40. That gives you an idea of how Gandhi, well, here's another quote from Gandhi's grandson. Horan Gandhi said, "You can quote me as saying Mahatma Gandhi would disagree with the Plowshares' actions because they employ tactics of secrecy and destruction of property. I also think locking up the most courageous and devoted peace leaders for long prison terms is a way of weakening the peace movement. Those leaders could do much more for peace outside of jail than in it." That's Horan Gandhi in the Jesus Journal, summer 1995, number 77, page 44. So I'm just trying to give you a feel for the general way the peace movement has moved, mainly through the Berrigan Brothers organization of the Plowshares movement, although it was basically right in its ends, it was apparently not in keeping with Merton's idea of a more gentle approach towards nonviolent actions.
Patty, you raised that specific point about Ukraine and William's response. Did you want to come back to that to make further reflection?
Well, it appears that that's what our Lord would do. Would let the Russians take over, but it almost doesn't seem too realistic or certainly popular. So I'm just kind of wondering, what's the right way to go with that? I mean, if if they exhibited what our Lord would do, which is, I think, let not resist them and save all those people from being killed and deal with it after they've taken over. But I don't know, it just seems so unpopular and far out to even present that as a way to go.
Thank you, Patty. William, do you want to come back to that?
Well, I would ask, do you think that Gandhi's methods in dealing with the British were unrealistic, or somehow do you think it would have been any better if Dr. Martin Luther King were to use violent methods in dealing with the injustice of the civil rights movement? I mean, granted that it might not be too popular, but is it more effective to run the risk of using the nonviolent methods rather than the violent methods, especially in light of modern warfare and the destructive power of it? Wouldn't it be more realistic to use the nonviolent methods and suffer the consequences while still trying to resist nonviolently some of the injustices, but not using violent means? Wouldn't it be more realistic generally to help us avoid so much destruction?
I think Patricia would like to say something. Patricia?
Yes, I think the real problem is that the Ukraine case is it's the worst case in a sense. There is very little evidence that Ukraine had negative intentions towards the Soviet Union. So you've actually got a situation where an aggressor makes an unprovoked violent attack. And it is very difficult to see how a non-violent response would have had any effect other than to exacerbate the situation by effectively inviting the Russians to roll straight over people, places, property, everything. Because it's the extreme case, it's the most difficult one to find any constructive response to. And I certainly have felt very ambivalent about the whole thing in a way I haven't over other wars and rumors of wars over the last 50 years or so. So I think that the comparators are not really persuasive. And that, I think, is the difficulty. I don't know what the solution is.
Sophronia, I think. Sophronia, would you? Yeah, thank you.
I agree. I agree with Patricia that it's an extreme case, and in an extreme case, I think you're going to see aspects of both sides, right? So I think that where nonviolence is possible, it is present. We saw that in the Russian people who have been protesting, right? If I'm misunderstanding it, I believe those have been nonviolent protests, and I hope it will continue to be that way. But I feel that where it is possible, nonviolence will exist, and where it is not, I just don't see how one can just let another country roll over and say, okay, come in, right? I understand that that's the thinking around nonviolence, but I just feel like you can't go one way or the other in this because the case is so extreme. That's just what I'm thinking.
May I say something here? This term roll over, keep in mind that Gandhi didn't just allow the British to roll over him. He had principles of nonviolent resistance. And the Ukrainians wouldn't have to just allow the Russians to roll over them. They would have to look for ways of resisting nonviolently. So there's alternatives. Granted, they don't look too good, but aren't they better than the actual destructiveness of the war, which is caused by both sides using violent means?
Paul Pynkoski.
Yes, let me take my hand down. I think we don't. I think sometimes that we look at that we don't perceive that there's a cost either way. In a violent conflict, there is a cost, and we see that in the Ukraine with immense destruction of buildings, of property, of human life. There's a cost with nonviolence as well, and in crossing the bridge with Martin Luther King, there was a very violent response on the part of the police and dogs and fire hoses. In India, on one occasion, I believe the British shot and killed some 1,500 people who were gathered in nonviolent protest. So there's either way the possibility of destruction and loss of life is there. It's hard. It's hard.
Gary.
Thank you, and thank you, William, for raising this massively complex reality. Following on what Sophronia said about this variety, I'm thinking of the incidents of interpersonal exchange between Ukrainians and some of those young soldiers coming in as remarkable acts of non-violence. The thing I'm finding helpful at the moment comes from Bonhoeffer and his idea of the penultimate. There are these ideals, and they're, in Christian terms, they're eschatological, the new creation, when all shall be redeemed and restored and so on. And non-violence belongs to that. And there's the penultimate, which is the dirty, messy, everyday, compromised human reality that most of us are living in. And where non-violence is possible, we still pursue it. Where it isn't, we beg God's forgiveness. That's what it comes down to.
Are there any more interventions, questions, including William?
I think my time has pretty much run out, but in general, I'm just saying that we're at a point now where war has become so destructive that we've got to find a solution to it. And part of the solution is going to be with this nonviolence. We've got to run the risk of the moving in the direction that I've suggested. And even Thomas Merton in his term, gentle revolutionary, that take a term he used for Gandhi.
Thank you, William, and thank you for bringing Ukraine and that situation into your talk very early on. I think any reader and admirer of Merton couldn't help but reflect on what's happening right now. So thank you. Okay, once again, many, many, many thanks, William. That was a wonderful start to this first seminar of this series of 5. So on behalf of the Thomas Merton Society, Great Britain and Ireland, many, many, many thanks. We're really glad that you've kicked us off. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you. I've
Over
enjoyed
to
it.
Paul. Great. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Over to Paul now. Just a brief reminder that the title of Paul's talk is Discerning Christ Among Us, Proximity as Spiritual Praxis. Thank you, Paul.
Anthony, thank you, and Maureen and Emily and the group that organized this. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you from Toronto. And I'll start. Originally, the conference question was, where is our hope? And it's not an academic question for Thomas Merton. His assertion that the real root of Christian hope is the presence of the risen Lord among us and in us by his Spirit, which is a spirit and power of love, comes from deep meditation on the meaning of the incarnation and his experience of the presence of the risen Christ. I wish to explore Merton's encounter with Christ, crucified and risen, in Haarlem, drawing from his journals, autobiography, and poetry. I want also to reflect on the impact of the transforming spiritual practice of proximity that developed in his life after Haarlem. By proximity, I mean intentionally bringing oneself into the presence of others who are strangers, particularly those who are destitute of different race, religions, and sexual orientation. I want also to explore this spiritual praxis as it emerged in the life and music of Horan. And finally, I'll reflect briefly on my experiences at the Common Table, a program in Toronto for people marginalized by poverty, addiction, and mental illness. So we'll start in Haarlem, or at least in Olean. Thomas Merton, as 1940 comes to a close and 1941 begins, is in a funk. I know not everyone would read his life this way, but consider he submitted novels to publishers that garnered no interest. His poetry had a similar fate, causing him to comment, "The poem I got back from the New Yorker today at least looked as if it had been handled." He is reading medieval theologians, Anselm, Aquinas, and Bonaventure, but his engagement with them seems somewhat abstract. He's not enjoying teaching. He's anxious about his military medical exam. His dream of a vocation has been crushed. He writes, I was very happy last year up to the time I learned I had no vocation for the priesthood and was not acceptable. Yet he feels in his bones that he wants to live as a monk, deciding if I could not live in the monastery, I should try to live in the world as if I were a monk in a monastery. He joins the Third Order Franciscans and begins wearing a scapular under his everyday clothes. But in the summer of 1941, there came to St. Bonaventure someone sent from God for the special purpose of waking us up, he wrote. Merton saw lights on in the college hall and could hear someone speaking with great vehemence. He entered. It was Baroness Catherine de Hoek. She accused her listeners of being more interested in their own comfort than in the suffering of the world. People were dying in the slums of Haarlem, crushed under the burden of colossal economic injustice, and Catholics were averting their eyes. She insisted that if Catholics were able to see Haarlem through the eyes of faith, they would see Christ's suffering in his members. Merton was electrified. He writes in his journal that she talked about martyrdom without embarrassment, as if it wasn't something abstract, and it left you ready to do some kind of action, renounce the world, live in total poverty, ministering to the poor in a certain definite way. He asked if he might come to see her. She agreed, and less than 2 weeks later, Merton found himself in Haarlem at Friendship House. Merton writes that he left Haarlem with the problem of another vocation. His journal entries in Run to the Mountain say little of what happened. He sorted dresses. He saw a play put on by children. On the way back to the subway, he heard a mother call out to her child, insisting he not fly his kite on the roof. In the days after Harlem, rather than engaging Aquinas and Bonaventure, he begins to look at social problems, particularly poverty, and offers, if I pretend to love God and I don't feed the poor, heal the sick, clothe the needy, how do I know my love is any love at all? A brief vacation leaves him bored and disgusted. He actually writes, I spit on New England. I spit on vacation resorts. He writes a short tale of a man who got rich manufacturing weapons, but instead of spending his fortune on luxuries, gave it away to the poor. The story closes with, and if you believe that, you're crazy. Merton now believes he is called to live in holy poverty, but struggles with what shape that might take. What happened in Harlem? Merton and the Baroness provide some clues. Merton writes, living in the same building as most of the Friendship House workers was an aging Negro woman, thin, quiet, worn out, dying of cancer. Everyone said she had visions of Our Lady. And when I saw her and spoke to her, I saw in this tired, serene, and holy face the patience and joy of the martyrs and the clear, unquenchable light of sanctity. The Baroness writes of Merton, he had eyes that took in everything they saw. They seemed to see very deeply. She recalls that he stared out at the slum, wrote a poem, and then he put his face on the windowsill and cried, I have to spend my lifetime to atone for this. The poem, which he dedicated to the Baroness, was Obad Harlem. It opens and closes with these lines. Across the cages of the keyless aviaries, the lines and wires, the gallows of broken kites crucify against the fearful light the ragged dresses of little children. The wives of rich white men appear as the spouse of Pilate, saying, daylight has driven iron spikes into the flesh of Jesus' hands and feet. 4 flowers of blood have nailed him to the walls of Harlem. In the force of Catherine de Hook's voice and witness, and in the presence of a dying, poverty-stricken Black woman, Merton witnessed for the first time the holiness of which he had previously only read. In the poverty of Black children imprisoned in the slums of Harlem, Merton encountered the crucified Christ. These experiences made a permanent impression. The Baroness and Merton corresponded for 25 years. He successfully waged a battle against the Cistercian censors to allow the publication of his secular journal, with the royalties going to support her work. He writes in 1959, Catherine is one who realizes more clearly than almost anyone I know that her neighbor is not only her neighbor, but also Christ. She is one to whom the doctrine of the mystical body is something more than a stimulating theory. Being in physical proximity to the poor of Harlem was not possible for Merton at Gethsemane. Meditative reading and letters became his tools for developing an imaginative spiritual praxis of proximity. Mograzat Epoch says Merton did not merely read literature, but meditated on it until the deep truths contained in it became part of him. His commitment to encountering Christ and others expands beyond poverty and race to include those of other faiths and those in foreign countries. Merton absorbed the writing of Boris Pasternak before contacting him via letter. He tells Pasternak that he finds in his writing my own experience, as if I were you. It is as if we met on a deeper level of life of which individuals are not separate beings. The commitment to placing himself in proximity with others is evident in his correspondence with the Black singer, Robert Lawrence Williams. Williams made the first approach, asking Merton if he would compose a series of poems on Black experience. Williams was hoping to set them to music. Unsatisfied with what he had initially written, Merton tells Williams he's heading to the Louisville Library to listen to a lot of spirituals and freedom songs. It is not that Merton was unfamiliar with Black America. He followed the civil rights movement, read James Baldwin and other writers, and he'd already published letters to a white liberal. But to truly engage with Williams, he had to go deeper. The truth of Christ present in the stranger informed Merton's critique of racism. He writes of lynching, it would not be easy for a Christian to mutilate another man string him up on a tree, and shoot him full of holes if he believed what he did to that man, he did to Christ. It is from experience then that he writes in disputed questions, my fellow man, just as he is, whether he is my friend or my enemy, my brother or a stranger from the other side of the world, whether he be wise or foolish, no matter what may be his limitation, is Christ. And he put that in italics. Merton calls otherworldly sanctity a sin against the incarnation when he satirizes plaster saints in Life and Holiness. Harlem comes to mind when he later writes, there is no charity without justice. Of what use is it to hold seminars on the doctrine of the mystical body and on sacred liturgy if one is completely unconcerned with the suffering, destitution, sickness, and untimely death of millions of potential members of Christ? Merton's grasp of our encounter with Christ as both concretely personal and ever-present mystery takes poetic form in Hagia Sophia, as he sees in a nurse gently rousing a patient from sleep, one Christ awakening in all the separate selves that ever were separate and isolated and alone in all the lands of the earth. And as Mary Sophia crowns the Logos and God enters his creation, it is as one homeless, lost in the night, without papers, without identification, without even a number, a frail, expendable exile who lies down in desolation. But this mystery finds its most powerful expression in his reflection on the parable of the Good Samaritan. It is in Christ himself. It is Christ himself who lies wounded by the roadside. It is Christ who comes by in the person of the Samaritan. And Christ is the bond, the compassion, and the understanding between them. Where one leans down in pity to help another, then there takes place a divine epiphany and awakening. Perhaps the encounter is outwardly sordid and unattractive, but the presence of God is brought about on earth there, and Christ is there, and God is in communion with man. Emily, we're moving to Bruce Cockburn, so you can put the information in the chat.
Okay.
I'm going to talk about Bruce Cockburn as a writer and about his music, but we don't have time to listen to it. So Emily's going to put some resources in the chat area that you can copy, YouTube videos of his songs, his memoir, and a website devoted to him. Thomas Merton and Canadian singer-songwriter Bruce Cockburn have much in common. Both were converts to Christianity in their 20s. Both exhibit a restless, searching spirituality expressed poetically, and each produced a body of work that reflects a refusal to be spiritually and intellectually pigeonholed. Cockburn's work, like Merton, is consistently autobiographical. He writes in his memoir, "My songs are not just about war, injustice, and exploitation. They are certainly not just about Jesus, though faith and grace frequently find a place in the lyrics and in the tune themselves. Mystery, beauty, love, pain, joy, the power of people to rise above oppression, above pettiness. These are the things I have worked to portray. The songs derive from life itself. Music is my diary, my anchor through anguish and joy, a channel for the heart." Cockburn's conversion to Christianity initially brought him into a fundamentalist style faith. Thankfully, friends introduced him to Télé Deschardins and Thomas Merton, moving him, in his words, beyond fundamentalism towards mystery. Cockburn left the Ottawa Valley for Toronto, Canada's largest city. Ballads about the countryside began to give way to harder-edged observations of urban life. He started making inquiries about travel, wanting to explore the world that existed beyond Canada and his band tours. Oxfam came knocking in 1982, hoping he would join a group of artists intending to visit Guatemalan refugees. Cockburn accepted and writes, "I knew in the deep place where we know such things that this shift would shift the course of my life." Before leaving for Central America, he was formally briefed by Oxfam, and a friend gave him a book of poems by Merton's former novice, Ernesto Cardinal. But he was completely unprepared for what he experienced at the Guatemala-Mexico border. At the Kanjul refugee camp, he witnessed poverty and suffering like he had never imagined. He writes, I had seen refugee camps on TV. Face to face, it was different. TV has no smell, no feel. This kind of poverty stinks. 3,000 inhabitants carried themselves with grace and dignity, though they were clearly desperate. That was the most moving part of being there, to see the suffering and to see the strength in the face of that suffering and the brutal theft of life and security. The refugees tried to build a school and a small infirmary, but the Mexican army came in and burned it all down. Guatemalan military helicopters would fly over the camp, strafing the inhabitants. Coburn's reaction was visceral. I experienced intense waves of emotion, alternately dark and light. There was nowhere for a greenhorn like me to find balance in such conditions. I was in awe, appalled, incensed. In his notebook, he scribbled, "Now I understand why people kill." He observes, to consider the evil humans inflict on one another is one thing. To feel the results through the faces and stories of the survivors was something other. Back in his bare hotel room, consuming a cheap bottle of scotch, he kept reliving the terrible stories. He writes, the quiet courage, the fierce determination and dignity of the refugees, the children still being children after all they'd seen, all of it hit me like an ice pick to the heart. Outraged, he imagined himself holding an RPG and blowing Guatemalan helicopters out of the air. He wrote the song, If I Had a Rocket Launcher. And I'm quoting from the lyrics. Here comes the helicopter, second time today. Everybody scatters and hopes it goes away. How many kids they've murdered, only God can say. If I had a rocket launcher, I'd make somebody pay. I don't believe in guarded borders, and I don't believe in hate. I don't believe in generals or their stinking torture states. And when I talk with the survivors of things too sickening to relate, if I had a rocket launcher, I would retaliate. The song speaks of death from starvation and how Guatemala has a corpse in every gate. He ends by declaring that if he had a rocket launcher, some son of a bitch would die. Coburn discovered that the violence he despised in the Guatemalan soldiers lived in his own heart. Yet in the midst of witnessing such violence, there is a growing compassion and a realization that a new vocation is emerging. Situation desperate, echoes of the victims' cries. I want to raise every voice, at least I've got to try. Every time I think about it, water rises to my eyes. The spiritual impact of the experience is captured in another song, Last Night of the World. I've seen the flame of hope among the hopeless, and that was truly the biggest heartbreak of all. That was the straw that broke me open. From this encounter grows a spiritual praxis of proximity. Coburn went to Nicaragua during its internal conflict, to Chile during the 1980s right-wing oppression, to Mozambique as the Civil War ended, and to Iraq with peacemaker Bishop Gumbleton after the U.S. invasion. Again and again, he placed himself alongside those experiencing violence and oppression. He offers, I began to understand that if an artist's job is to distill the human experience into something that can be shared, then the political, as much as part of that experience is God or sex or alienation, deserves to be seen as raw material. Songs emerged from each pilgrimage, bearing witness to what he had seen, the haunted eyes of a 15-year-old veteran soldier with a machine gun, kids playing in sewage-filled streets, a car bomb that lights the morning sky. The surrounding culture finds its way into his rhythms and harmonies. Hints of divine presence are hidden in these encounters. The murder of the oppressed is described as some kind of never-ending Easter passion. In Nicaragua, he sings of dust and diesel rising like incense from the road, smoke of offering on a revolution morning. In Santiago, the ringing of church bells for early morning mass become a backdrop for the resistance of shantytown residents to military thugs. The resurrection moment is found in the midst of oppression. He writes, first mass rings through smoke and glass, day flowers out of the night. Creatures of the dark and disarray fall before the morning light. Bells of rage, bells of hope, as a 10-year night wears down. Sisters and brothers are coming home. See them rising like grass through cement in the Santiago dawn. Though his lyrics infrequently speak of Christ directly, it is indeed Christ Coburn has discovered in the faces of strangers. A decade later, his Central American experience recontextualizes the birth story from Matthew's Gospel in his song Cry of a Tiny Babe. Herod is described as a paranoid man who, upon hearing of Christ's birth, sends death squads to kill all male children under 2. The pattern in Coburn is similar to the one seen in Merton. In the ambivalence of his life circumstances, Coburn said yes to an invitation that placed him in proximity to those who faced poverty, suffering, and oppression. He encountered people carrying themselves with strength, dignity, and grace, forging hope in the midst of death. The experience of being in proximity, being in relationship, created a shift in his perspective. It became motivation to develop an intentional practice of proximity, placing himself alongside those suffering poverty and violence. Through song, he bears witness to their circumstances, developing a powerful critique of the injustices inflicted by Western culture. In Broken Wheel, another song, Merton offers a prayer that echoes themes we find. Coburn offers a prayer, we hear echoes of Merton in it. Lord, spit it in our eyes that we can see how to wake up from this tragedy. This is my trouble. Can't be an innocent bystander in a world of pain and fire and steel way out on the rim of the broken wheel. Coburn and Merton hold places on the world stage. Most of us do not. But that does not mean that the Spirit is not beckoning to us in our local communities, drawing us into proximity with the homeless, refugees, and those who suffer the violence of poverty. I want to reflect briefly on my own experience. I don't do so with the intention of making an example of myself, but rather in the spirit of Merton's prayer, my Lord God, I have no idea where I am going, as I did not set out to learn this firsthand. Forced into an early retirement, I thought I might help out for a few weeks at the Common Table, our parish outreach for homeless and vulnerable people. A few weeks has become 9 years. We share a meal each Wednesday. We formed a literature group. I learned it was not my help they needed. They have, in fact, become my teachers. Hope, compassion, and perseverance, their lessons. I now number as friends those who live on the street, people with mental health problems, and addicts. Among them, former artists and financial analysts, a former Jesuit priest, a former teacher, Indigenous people suffering from intergenerational trauma. Homelessness was not a choice for any one of them. It is hard and joyous work, but it takes its toll. Encountering Christ crucified and risen occurs while hanging out in places of sorrow, loss, and burial. 2 friends murdered. 1 death from AIDS. Several lost to ailments that went untreated. 2 overdose deaths. 1 friend frequently arrested when his medication isn't taken and his behavior becomes erratic. Christ is crucified, and those our society chooses to write off. But these same friends offer signs of resurrection, life reimagined, a street person now in supportive housing, an addiction broken, the gift of a cigar to celebrate my grandson's birth. Discerning Christ crucified and risen in others is not the full story. Like Coburn, being in proximity to those who are poor and oppressed became the straw that broke me open. Through encountering those I perceived to be unlike me, I encountered the one Christ awakening in all the separate selves that ever were separate and isolated and alone. It has altered my understanding of both humanity and divinity. I did not see myself called to these friendships, nor as developing a particular spiritual praxis. I only see that now in hindsight. Coburn insists we cannot be innocent bystanders. Merton challenges us directly, writing, "One is not expected to solve all the problems of the world, but one should know when one can do something to alleviate suffering and poverty. Christian charity is meaningless without concrete and exterior acts of love. What are we doing about it? It is not enough to reach into our pockets and hand over a few dollars. We must give not only our possessions, but ourselves to our brother. He writes this in Life and Holiness. The clear message from both Merton and Coburn is that the revelation of Christ, crucified and risen, and the compassion and hope that emerged from that encounter require that we be in the presence of or in relationship with the poor, the stranger, and those we perceive as enemies. It is in the presence of the person that we receive the invitation or challenge, as with Merton and Catherine. It is in the presence of the person that Christ, crucified and risen, is discerned, as in the children of Harlem or Guatemala. Merton and Coburn, in pointing out the real root of Christian hope is the presence of the risen Lord among us and in us, at the same time demonstrate for us through their lives where that encounter takes place. Not often in books or churches, but among the poor, the oppressed, the imprisoned, the refugee. In all those places, we are inclined not to venture, and in all those persons, we are inclined not to see. Thank you.
Paul, thank you so much. So very much indeed. We'll go over to questions and reflections and observations, and I think I didn't have my specs on properly, but I think Sophronia might have flagged an intervention. Is that right? I can't.
Well, I was actually applauding Paul.
Okay.
but I do have a reflection.
Go ahead.
That I would share, because Paul, I heard in there something connecting to William's talk as well. I was particularly moved by the lyrics that from the Coburn song about recognizing that the violence he hates is actually within him.
Yes.
And I feel that, and Merton talks about that as well, that he realizes that he's not practicing nonviolence when he even has mean thoughts about the Reverend Father, because he was always at odds with him and
Yes.
annoyed with him. And he realizes that is not nonviolence, that he has to solve that within himself. And I feel that for us to all make that recognition when we can, like you said, to be in the presence of what we consider to be the enemy. And usually those strong feelings mean that there is something of that within ourselves. That to me, that is the foundation of compassion and empathy. It reminds me of, if anyone knows The Lord of the Rings, in the film at one point, Frodo talks about Gollum saying, I have to believe that he can come back. I have to believe in redemption for this person because I know that what is in him is in me. So if there's redemption for him, there will be redemption for me. And I just feel that connection is so huge in so many of the conflicts that we have, both in terms of war and peace, with race relations, that we need to find within ourselves that kind of compassion so that we can find that redemption for all of us. So thank you.
I think what you said, Sophronia, reminds me of Brian Stevenson, the author of the founder of Equal Justice Initiative and the author of Just Mercy. That Brian, not knowing what he wanted to do, just like Merton and Coburn, volunteered to work a summer with someone who was working to deal with people on death row. And for the first time in his life, walks into a jail, walks into and sits down with a guy in a cell and realizes that this guy's just like me. And they ended up singing Methodist hymns together. And that totally changed the direction of his life. Now we have 150 people off death row, wrongly convicted. Just amazing. But it was getting close that did that. Yeah.
Fiona has a question.
Hi there. Thanks very much, Paul. And it's nice to see you after all this Facebook time. I really was interested in Bruce Coburn's descriptions and was thinking how it reminded me of the bit in Merton in the Asian Journal, well, actually in the other side of the mountain, about being in Calcutta. And he's sort of overwhelmed by the people and the poverty and whatever. But he uses this really interesting phrase, which is about the unmasked city. And I think there's something about when we allow ourselves to be in proximity with people who we may not always feel instantly comfortable with, that we're exposing ourselves to unmask ourselves as well. I mean, he talks about the unmasked city. I think it's sort of unmasked worlds. He's got something about a description. Oh, it's my cat getting in the way. Description about one who knows the world. And I think, you know, it's this unmasking that needs to happen, that has clearly happened for you in your fellowship actions and so on. And sometimes we so try to defend ourselves from being unmasked and seeing the world unmasked. So thanks. There's lots to think about there.
Thank you, Fiona. My friend John Brooks, another singer-songwriter here in Toronto, his dog, which he takes for a walk every night, dragged him down an alley one night instead of staying on the usual streets. And the encounter there among glass and needles and everything else was a homeless person looking for bottles who stopped to speak with a waitress who was exhausted, looking for a light for a cigarette out in the back alley. And it's turned into a song called in the alleys and in love we find the truth. And he said it's changed his whole idea of what the city is about. But again, it's that being somewhere where you wouldn't be, or you shouldn't, or you think you shouldn't be, and finding out that that person is you. Yeah. John Brooks is another person, Jon Brooks, another person who amazingly literate and deeply moving, deeply insightful songs. Yeah. I'm looking at the gallery view. I see nobody waving, nobody jumping up and down, no more hands raised.
I mean, Emily, can I ask something or make an observation? Is that all right?
Of course you can.
Thank you. Thank you. I haven't really thought this through, but I sort of linking a little bit with what William said earlier, and he singles out Mohandas K. Gandhi and Martin Luther King and positions them, in my view, rightly, in exemplary ways in terms of how we might understand nonviolence and peacemaking. And while William was speaking, I was thinking that that's to do in part with how they relate to the world, and they relate to the world deliberately and self-consciously. And the word you use for that, if I may suggest, Paul, is proximity. When you are indexing proximity in your talk, you're referencing a kind of self-consciousness and a deliberateness about how we are present to the other. And again, in both talks, how we are present to the other that we can't stand in ourselves. That other that we find uncomfortable. Merton kind of has a conversation with himself in terms of the true and the false self.
Yes. Yeah.
But yeah. It struck me that that when you look at the examples you've used, Paul, as well as the examples from William's talk, that, and it came to me quite strongly when you mentioned James Baldwin, that it's precisely in the moment of suffering that hope and redemption is present exactly at the same time. Mm-hmm. And that in the moment of suffering, which is deeply, deeply personal, sometimes it's social as well as in war, but war is felt personally, that in those moments, that is where is hope. And I think in Merton's later writings in the 60s, I wonder if that is something that he is also trying to express then almost every day, not least from the early to mid 60s. But when you mentioned Baldwin, and again, I thought it was an interesting instance, because although Cleaver really embraces what Merton has to say about Harlem, it strikes me in terms of the aesthetic and in terms of the proximity that poetry can achieve, then it's Baldwin, James Baldwin, who is able to hold that very deeply and at the same time hide the suffering that is clearly present throughout his life.
Yeah, and I think in Merton too, some of those powerful statements or powerful portrayals of our world are in his poetry about Harlem, about Auschwitz, about Hiroshima, about the black girl holding a doll, the picture of a black girl holding a doll in the church that was blown up or burned down in Alabama, I believe it was. But yeah, the poetics of that.
I'm very grateful I'd one's work, and I'd kind of forgotten a wee bit, and then when you mentioned him, I just had many connections, so thank you for that. Mike Catling, I think. Mike Catling.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Mike.
I'm just thinking about the phrase awakening to Christ. And I'm conscious in myself of the fearfulness of that statement, because to awaken to Christ is to be prepared to make that journey to our own metaphorical Jerusalem. In other words, to be prepared for crucifixion, that opening up to the suffering of others in all its various forms. And I remember reading somewhere years ago Merton talking about how difficult it is to get to the other side of the cross. In other words, to get to that place of resurrection, which allows us to deepen our faith and deepen our trust in a God of love. And I'm not sure, listening tonight, just how far I can awaken or feel I can awaken, balancing against the fear of what that actually means, wanting to do it, desiring to do it, but feeling such a fearfulness about it all. It's that kind of complexity.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mike.
Sophronia would like to say something.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just going to comment on what Mike said, because it is a fearful thing. But I think it helps to remember that it is our personal journey, that it is not something strange and disconnected from us. The poet Rilke in Letters to a Young Poet, he talks about that, about how if we go within, we will know that the things that happen to us, that when we come upon these important parts in our journeys, we will recognize that these moments have come from within. They're not coming from without, and that these moments that we are totally available to it, that we probably have more bravery than we realize, if we can come to know ourselves in a certain way and recognize the challenge when it comes. So I just wanted to make that point, that it is scary, but we have it within us to see what we need to see and do what we need to do.
We've probably got time for one more brief observation before we thank Paul and William and just flag details of the next meeting. So if there's one more brief observation. Paul, I think Paul Pearson, sorry, yeah.
Oh, yes.
Sorry, just working out how to unmute myself. Yeah, two brief observations. Thank you both to William and to Paul. It's been very stimulating words that you've given us this afternoon. So there's a lot of things kind of flying around. But two thoughts that have come. One was, and I think it connects a bit with what Sophronia was saying, and was it Mike, I think, before that, connecting with things in ourselves and with Baldwin, because it was very much Merton rereading or reading Baldwin in the 60s that led him into writing about racism and civil rights. That when he read, Baldwin's Letter from a Region of My Mind, which someone sent him soon after it was published in the New Yorker, his first published piece on racism is then a defense of what Baldwin's saying. And so much of that is about, that essay is about Baldwin's experience of Harlem. So it really seemed to, tie in with Merton's own memory of being in Harlem. And as Baldwin's writing about Harlem, it would have been around the same time that Merton was there. He would have been a teenager preaching on the streets around the same time that Merton would have been working at Friendship House. And the other brief thought was about that term unmasking. And again, I think as I see so much of the news coverage about what's going on in Ukraine, to ask that question, can we unmask the enemy and see who they really are? Because we just get forced into these two distant positions. And I think it's very, very hard to do. And, I've heard stories on the news of, recordings of interviews with people from Russia. And, when people are almost brainwashed by the message coming out of the Kremlin, it becomes very hard to see them for who they really are. And so, that's just something that was very much left with me from what you both said this afternoon, or this evening. Thank you.
I think one of the sadnesses I said at the outset was not having the conference either in 2020 or 2022, and that was partly because whilst the keynotes are always exciting and everyone is gathered together, the conference also has smaller seminars two papers presented and intimacy, and where folk are able to share the richness of Merton's, and as I say, with a sense of presence for each other and Merton, and an intimacy which exceeds us. My feeling, and I'm sure I'm not alone in this, that tonight has been just that. It's been absolutely wonderful. I'm so excited and so moved that I'm about to revert into my Geordie, which for those across the pond is my regional accent, and you wouldn't understand it, so I'm going to have to continue like this. But it was a wonderful evening. Thank you so much on behalf of the Thomas Merton Society GBI, to William and to Paul, and to everyone who's been involved tonight as an attendee, as someone who's made an intervention. The presence has been special. One of the attendees tonight, who I won't name, I always get nervous before doing things like this, and she said to me in the past, "You can't fail, it's Merton." And I think we are blessed with Merton's richness, and I think Paul and William have reaffirmed that. So thank you both very much indeed. You've set the bar very high. Thanks to everybody from the United States and I think Spain as well, and other places, not least the UK. Finally, the next seminar is the 7th of July, same time, 7 p.m. UK time. James Cronin and Bernadette McNary-Zach, and Merton's Resonance with Vinoba Barbe, and Can We Trust Thomas Merton on Peace and War. I'm sure it will be just as wonderful and stimulating tonight. Thank you, everyone. Good night.